Just before we start, I want to know those who are here during the introduction to Python, the first session one. If you were part of the training or the meeting, you can just like raise your hand in Zoom, and so I know if you were able to join and see, because this is a continuation to that session. So I would say if I need to go over some of the things before we start with today's session or not. Okay, so Elizabeth was here. Okay, seems Elizabeth is the only one. Okay, right. What we would do is, just so that we continue and it wouldn't be as though we're going over what we did, I'll just do like a quick recap of some of the things we talked about in the first session, and then we would go ahead, continue and talk about what we have for today's session. So if you just joined or you just came in the chat, I think you can just introduce yourself. I know we are few, but you can just introduce yourself in the chat so that we get to know one another, right? So just for those who do not know me, I am Akra Oseiwaah Ahenkorah, part of Women Who Code and leading the introduction to Python session. Okay. All right. So our last session, what we talked about mainly were the value types we have in Python. So we talked about value types being numbers, strings, right? Like if it's a text or it's an integer type or it's a Boolean type, right? And then we then talked about the data types that we have, specifically string, integers, floats, right? And then Boolean. And then I think right after that, we also talked about the operators that are available. We talked about operators and also variables, right? Variables being just containers for some value, okay? And then operators that are available. That is one's for the numbers, one that works with the strings. And then we did talk about some inbuilt functions. Built-in functions, right, for Python. And the ones that we mainly talked about was print. We weren't able to complete that, and hopefully we'll get to talk more about that today. But then it's mainly print. So we went through how to print some information, right? Some text. We want to print some text in Python, how that goes. And just with the knowledge we had on variables, with values, these operators, and the print function, built-in function, we created a simple BMI application in Python. Okay, so we did create a simple BMI application in Python, just using the knowledge on values, variables, operators, and print. Okay, so that is all we did in the first session. For this being session 2 and continuing from where we ended the last time, we are now moving to Boolean, right? So the main plan for today, what we'll be covering is Boolean expressions, logical operators, conditional execution, and functions. Okay, so that's what we'll be covering. And as I said, this is built on our previous one, which was basics on variables. So we'll be using our knowledge from the first session, that is variables and values, right? And building on that. If you do have any question at any point in time, you can interrupt. You can put your question in the chat as well, and I would respond to that. So mainly for we'll start with the Boolean expression, right? So now we've already talked about data types, and we know that we have Boolean as a data type, right? And a Boolean data type is either true or a false, right, in Python. So in this case, for a Boolean expression, we are looking at some expression that evaluates to either a true or false, right? So we have some expression that you know that at the end, when you're evaluating this, what you're getting is either a true or a false. Okay, so these are Boolean expressions, and examples would be comparison, right? Comparing something, or equating something here. So if I say 2 is greater than 1, that is a true statement, right? Because 2 is greater than 1. If I were to say that maybe 1 is greater than 5, it's a false statement. Okay, so this statement or this expression here actually evaluates to either true or false, right? So it's a Boolean expression. So for when if I were to say maybe 1, as I said, 1 is greater than 5. Okay? So if you have 1 is greater than 5, I get false. Okay, so it's false. So although I've written 1 is greater than 5, the value is actually a false value, right? So at the end, evaluates to this statement is actually a false statement. So what I have as a value is false. Okay, so these are the expressions. So just looking at the different ways or these different expressions that we have. So as I already said, we have greater than, so this is simple, right? This is math. So I have greater than, less than, greater than or equal to. Okay, so enter here. So if I have greater than or equal to in Python, you would write, you have your greater than sign and just followed by equal to. Okay, so less than or equal to, these are all comparisons. If I were to say that not equal to, right? So I have, I also have not equal to, right? Which would also evaluate to that. In the same way, I also have equal to, right? So if something is equal in terms of comparison. Okay, so these are all, this is also available. Okay, so let's see, in comparison, so you would have, right, so if I have, oh wait, so equal to, if I have this, oh, what software do we use for Python? Okay, good question then. Okay, good question. So for our first session, I think I talked about some example, some of the softwares or scripting tools or IDEs that you can use for Python. So there are multiple, there are many that are out there, but you can use Visual Studio Code, VS Code. What I'm using currently is called VS Code, right? It's not only limited to Python, but you can use that for Python. And there's PyCharm, right? There are so many. Visual Studio itself, you can even use that for Python. There's Jupyter Notebook, right? So that also, you can also use that for Python. So there are so many. You can even use a simple notepad, right, to write Python. It's just that if you're using these other integrated environments like Visual Studio Code, it gives you some extra functionality. Like sometimes it would, if you made a mistake, you get all these signs and indications. So it makes it easier for you to code. So I'll probably recommend Visual Studio Code because I think it's really easy. But then there are so many other tools that you can use. Okay. All right. So one of the interesting, I think, just remember, one of the interesting operators here or comparison operators that we have here is the equal to, right? So when we talked about in our first session, we said that if I said maybe weight is equal to weight. Okay, so if I said that weight is equal to 6, what I'm doing here is actually assigning the value 6 to this variable weight. Okay, so I'm just creating a variable called weight, assigning the value 6 to it, right? So now you have this, and for us looking at it, we see that this is an equal to sign, right? So Python sees this equal to as an assignment operator, okay, which means when Python sees it, it's assigning some value, right? So some value on the right is being assigned to some value on the left. So just an equal to isn't a comparison, right? So that's it. But now if you want to compare two values, that's when you use this to the double equal to sign. Okay, so if I have double equal here, then Python sees that, oh, what I really want to do is compare the value on the right and on the left. Okay, if it's just 1, it sees it as an assignment. So you want to assign a value to something. Okay, so let's just take note of that. So with these operators, and whenever these are used, they're actually evaluating to a true or false. So they end up evaluating to some true or false statement. So whether the value on the left or a statement on the left or right, in the end, it would evaluate to a true or false. Right? So now that we know that, now we can look at our BMI code and just apply it in there somewhere, right? And let's see, is there something we can do here for this to work? So I think before we do that, adding it to our BMI, just a Boolean expression might not be enough, right? So let's move on to something else so that it makes it more fun, right? If I just put in a Boolean expression, it will probably work here, but then it doesn't really give the output I would really want or would really want, right? So let's just take note of these Boolean expression. We're going to use it in our version 2 of our BMI app. Okay, so I said earlier, if I say 1 is equal to 2, right? So if I have 1 is equal to 2, we know that is false, so I'll get a false statement. Now, in the same way, we've talked about variables, so does that mean that I can probably assign something like this to a variable? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts. Can I assign this comparison to a variable? Is it possible to do that since it's evaluating to some value? Is it possible to store this value in some variable? You can please put it in the chat, right? Or raise your hand. It's something to just think about. We've talked about being able to evaluate these statements. So can I really store this value in a variable and use it later on? Is there something that I can do? Okay. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts. Yes. Okay, Nabia, yes. Great. Oh, please interact. Yes, I'm getting a lot of yes. Okay, so I have 2 yes. Nobody's saying no. So okay, let's go ahead and see. So now I want to say seems possible. Okay, right. So let's try. Let's find out together, right? If it would be possible or not. So said 1 is equal to 2. Let's give it some variable name. Okay, I'm going to give a long variable name here. So it's 1 2. Okay, as I said, my variable name is long. So it's 1 equal to 2. This is what we want to evaluate, and then in the end, we are just going to print it. We talked about print the last time. Print being just outputting some text or some value on your screen. Okay, so yes, so actually what I have here as false is because I printed my variable, right? So now is 1 equal to 2 variable, which the name is very long, actually stored this, right? So it's possible. So it's possible to actually store some Boolean expression and assign it to a variable. Okay, all right, great. So now that we have that, let's move on to some other operators we have. We've talked about Boolean expressions now. Let's go to logical operators. So logical operators, we have just 3. Okay, so you have either an and, or not. Okay, so for logical operators, we have, let me just write it here so that we can have that later. So logical operators would be and, or, and then not. Okay, so these are the 3 logical operators we have in Python. Okay, so what does that mean then? So we do know, I think probably from science or maths, we know that if you have a true statement and a true statement, that would evaluate to a true, right? If you're using and, so far as one of the statements is false, it becomes false, right? So with 1 or more being false, then it becomes false. If you have an or, as long as there's at least 1 being true, it would evaluate to true, okay? And then not would more of like negate it. So if you already have a true and you have a not before that, you're saying that now it's false. Okay, so this also helps. So maybe you want to say, okay, one is two is greater than one, and okay, let's use 3 instead. So 3 is greater than 1 and 3 is greater than 2. Okay, so we know that this would evaluate 2. So let's see. 3 is greater than 1, and so that's how you definitely write it. And 3 is greater than 2. Okay, so that's how you're going to write it. Simple statement. This is easy. This is like English. Right? So 3 is greater than 1 and 3 is greater than 2. And we should see this being true. Okay, so the moment one of this is false, if I said, and maybe 3 is less than, then we are going to get a false here. Okay, right, so that will become false. So all this is also going to help, right? Because in programming, at some point you would use this, right? At some point you'd use it. So it's good to just understand when you can have all these Boolean or true or false statements. And the point where we'd be using it is where we are going to next. That is conditional execution. Okay. So mainly when you're writing any code, or let's stick to Python here. So in Python, you would, the execution of your code, right? Any code you've written starts from the bottom, the top to the bottom, right? So from line 1 to whichever line number you end at. Okay, so the first line runs, it goes on to the next line, right? That is the general execution. That is how your Python code will run. Start from line 1, move sequentially, line 2, then it goes on to execute it. But then usually in an application, okay, I think Andrew has a question, so let's just do this. Just leave my name Python and notes. Oh, okay. Andrew, are you saying why the application, why the language is called Python? Is that the question? Oh yes, why Python? That's interesting. So I think that's also something that I haven't actually researched on. I don't know. I've known that it's called, the language is Python, and those who created it called it Python, but I haven't really seen it anywhere. I haven't really investigated to see, okay, why did they call it Python, right? Like, it's like anybody naming anything. Why did they choose that specific name? That's something I'm not really sure. I think I'll try and find that out and share it one of these days. And if there's anybody here who knows the origin of Python and why they named it Python, you can put it in the chat. Okay. All right, so Andrew, I hope somebody here knows and they will put it in there. If not, I would find that out and share that information. Okay. That is if it is available. So moving on then. So for, I was talking about the execution. So it's always from line 1 to whichever line, so it's sequential, line 1, line 2, that's how it would run, right? So if we have, going back to this application that we created, our version 1, we had our first line being this, that is assign value 69 to variable called weight, right? So it moves on, executes this first. The second is assign 170 to a variable called height cm. Okay, then it moves on to the third line. Comments are always skipped because they are not executed. Okay, so that will probably be line from line 5 here, but then it would not be executed because it's a comment. So we move on to ones that need to be executed, and it's moving sequentially. But applications or life, any applications are being used to solve real world problems, right? And there are always conditions when it comes to things in life, right? There are some specific things that you'd want to do based on some particular condition, right? So something should happen before that action is taken. So in this case, in Python, you would use conditional statements to control it. Okay, so this is in terms of whether something should happen or not based on some condition, right? So you would use the conditional statements. And one of the conditional statements that we will be looking at is the if statement, right? So we're starting with if, and there are multiple variations of it, but then there's if, right? So if, right? So if statement. So if statement here is you would have your if, how that is written in terms of syntax. You have your if, then right after that you're looking at so right after your if statement, you're looking at the condition, right? What condition, when should it run, right? What condition should be true before that if statement works, right? So if is either evaluating to something. So I could just say, because if it's always looking at that Boolean value, is it true or is it false, right? If it's true, do this. So that's what if would do, right? If it's true, do this. That is all that does. So if I say if true, which I can just write here. So if I say if true, so you have your condition, and I'm putting true here because your condition is supposed to evaluate to either true or false, right? So it's a Boolean expression. And right after that, you have your colon, right? So it's colon. And then you move on to your next line, right? So syntax. So if first, your expression, your Boolean expression, which is evaluating to either true or false, right? You end with a colon. And in Python, the moment you have a colon, it says that, okay, there is some block, there's something that should happen when the first statement is working, right? So now you're saying that, okay, if it is true, move on to this next statement, or all these things in these blocks should run only when it's true. Okay, all right, I hope that is clear. So there's your if first, your Boolean expression, then you have your colon, and then the actions that need to be taken afterwards move on to your next line right after your colon. And colon here in Python always opens a block of code, right? So a new block of code. So new block here, you would see that the moment I had, because I'm using this VS Code, the moment I entered the colon and moved on to the next line, you see there's a shift, there's an indentation. Okay, I didn't talk about it last time. Okay, all right, yes. So we have somebody putting in why they had why is Python, right? Okay, great. Thank you, Elias. So mainly a block of code here. So you would see that there is some indentation where my if is and where this new cursor moved to is different, right? And one of the things that's extremely important in Python is indentations, right? So space. The moment you move or indent the code, right, put some space before the code, your code starts, you're telling Python that, okay, this is a new block, right? So all codes that have the same space before the code starts are always in the same block. Okay, so the moment you shift and add some extra space, you are creating a new block. Okay, all right, so let's just keep that in mind. So indentations are extremely important when it comes to Python. So when I say if true, let's see, print, if true, print, oh wait, okay, sorry, moved on to, so if true, print, this is running, right? If true, print, this is running, right? Because I put in true, it means I would run. So let's run this. So it said this is running, okay, because this is true. So in the same way, this is like the simplest if statement I would write. Now, in the same way, just so that we see how that is affecting the code execution, let's add some other, let's add some code before and after, okay, so that we see that. So it says, okay, so let's do print, print, sorry, let's go print line 1, and then we have after our if, and go again and see print print line. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, print line 5. Okay, so we ended up being 55 instead. Okay, so when I run this, I'm supposed to see all three, right? So I'm seeing that line 1, then because this is true, it says this is running, then we are on line 5. Okay. Now let's put in an expression instead of just putting a Boolean value. So if I say if 1 is less than 2, okay, and we know that 1 is less than 2 either evaluates to true or false, right? So if 1 is less than 2, which is true, right? So it means that it's a true statement. So the same thing happens. The moment I change that to 1 is greater than 2, we know this is false. So you see that this line here doesn't run, right? Because it did not evaluate to true. Okay, so this is where you change the actions that the Python application would take, right, based on specific conditions. Right, so this is just so that you understand the basics of how that works. Okay, and the same way, now usually in action is not just one. It's not always taking an action based on just one condition, right? There's sometimes an else statement, like there's an alternate. So if it's true, do this else, which means it's false, do this other thing. Okay, so in Python it would be the same thing, and it's still English here. So I end up saying else, right? So else, which should be at the same level, should have the same indentation as your if. And just like the if, you just have else, and then you have your colon, you move on to your next line, which starts the block that should run when it's an else, right? So I say else, print this else here, right? Okay, so when we run this, because our condition here is false, right? Because 1 is definitely not greater than 2, the else part runs. Okay, right, and this part does not run. So with this basic understanding, now that we know what conditional execution is, because now we know how to write an if, we know how to write an else, right? Let's go on with version 2 of our BMI application. Okay, so we said our BMI application is simple. We had weight, we had variables, one for weight, one for height, and then our height is in centimeters, so we converted it to meters, right? Divided it by 100, and then we drew out our final calculation, right, which is our BMI calculation. That is weight divided by height squared in meters. Okay, and just with that, we print our final BMI. Okay, great. So we're going to do the same thing, but now we have our version 2. We're going to add some conditions here, right? So just going to copy my comments here, move it down there, and then we upgrade our BMI application with a version 2. Okay, so beginners version 2, right? So now let's go. So with this, we start with our weight again. So weight variable is equal to, let's say, 68. And let's just add a comment here and say weight is in kilograms, right? And then we have our height centimeters, and say that is 170. Okay, and just so it's visible, and next time we come to our code, we know what we were actually writing here. Commenting would help us keep that in mind, right? So height and cm. Now we are going to convert our height to meters. Okay, so height in meters would be our new variable, height m, which is height in meters. This is supposed to be our old height variable, right? So our application is still beginner's version. We've not learned how to take input from users yet. So this is like fixed. This value can't be changed. It's always the same. So let's go ahead and convert this to meters. So now that we've converted it to meters, let's calculate our BMI. So calculate BMI, and this is, we know BMI calculation. So our variable called BMI is going to be our weight value, which is stored in our variable. So our weight divided by our height squared, right? So let's go our height, and we learned that height in meters squared. So our height in meters squared, and we learned that if we want to in Python for squared, you see that height in meters times height in meters, right? Or we can use the 2 star sign to say that to represent exponents. Okay, so if I use this 2 star sign here, I'm saying exponent 2. Okay, so now I have my BMI value. Just to add some conditions, because now we know conditional statements, right? We know what that means. So let's try and say, okay, if it's some value, we tell the user that whoever's weight and height, we tell the person, oh, okay, normal weight, then if not abnormal weight, I don't know which one, right? Like, there are so many things. I think in BMI they have underweight, normal weight, overweight, and obesity, right? But right now we only know if and else, so let's just go with 2, right? So we just want, if it is this is normal weight, not anything else is abnormal, right? So we'll use our if statement here. So we say if, and I think for BMI, for normal weights, I believe it should be between 18.5 and 25. Okay, so we say that when BMI is between, so 18.5. So when our BMI value, right? So we need our BMI value. So when our BMI value is greater than, right, greater than or equal to 18.5, and right, we learned logical, so we end. So and our BMI value again is less than 25. Okay, so this, when this is true, there's the only time that we have normal weight. So then we'll say that, okay, print, wait, let's actually, for the user to see, let's print the BMI so the person knows that, yeah, okay, this is your weight, right? So print, let's see, your BMI is, okay, your BMI is, let's go, BMI. Okay, so say that your BMI is this, and then we print here if it is normal or it's not. Okay, so normal weight. Okay, so we just know else, so we go to if and else, we would print I just say not normal. Abnormal seems weird, so non normal. Okay, so non normal weight is not normal. Okay, so something like this. So now we have our version 2, right? So simple one. Now we've added some conditions to it. So let's just run it and see what happens. So it says, okay, BMI is actually 23 something something something, which is still less than 25, right? So then it tells you get a normal weight value. Okay, so I think that is cool. So if I were to change the height here and make it a height, I don't know which one would, let's make the height 100. and run this. Now, because my BMI is bigger, the 68 is saying weight is not normal, right? Okay, so that is it. So we've used our conditional statement here in our version 2 of our beginner's BMI application. Okay. Okay, so with conditional, let's see. We still, I think conditional, we know just if and else, right? There's still more to it. We are not only limited to if else, because there are cases where it's okay, if it is this, else if it's right, there's an else and there's an if, right? So we want to say if this is true, else if this other condition is true, then do this, right? And your else would be like when none of those are true. Okay, so in Python we have that as well. So in Python you have an if, elif, and else. Okay, so in that case, in this case, what you do is how that is written is you have your if true, right? If whichever condition, you have this, and then could wait, sorry, so code goes here. Then you have your elif, right? So elif. So elif here means that you have another statement. Okay, so you have elif. What is it? Elif another. Let's say true. Something else is true again. And then with that you also have your code goes here. Okay. So, and then finally you have your else. Okay, so that's also one of the things that Python allows us. Okay, so if, elif, and we use that in our BMI code. Okay, so and then we have our else again, and else to some code goes here, right? So it's here. Okay, so that is how you would write that. So let's just use that in our BMI application. Okay, so we said that if the BMI is, we said if BMI is greater than 18.5 and it is less than 25, then my weight is normal. Okay, so let's see, let's add another else if and see that elif BMI is less than, if it is less than 18.5, right? If it's less than 18.5, if it's less than 18.5, then what we want to print here is see that you're underweight. Okay, so 18.5 is, if you're less than that, you're underweight. Okay. Right, so now we have three instead of the first one. We had just if and else. Now we have another condition that we've added. So if our BMI is between 18.5 and 25 normal weight, Tavares is less than 18.5 is underweight. And if there's anything else, the weight is good. It's not a normal weight. Okay, so so let's just run that and see. So we had, I think our current value, because the 68 will definitely be not normal. Okay, so let's use some big value and see. I don't know what 180 would do. 180 is still normal weight, so let's go like if I'm like 190 height, right? Like 190 centimeters, which is very tall. That's still normal weight. Okay, all right. So well, let's make it 2 meters then. So 200. Okay, so now you just became underweight. Okay, so so that's it. So now we've seen if, elif, and else. Okay, there are a lot of combinations for this. You can nest them as much as you want. You can nest it as much as you want, being that you can have some if else, and your block here would have another if else in there, right? Although I don't know if it would be extremely advisable, because too many nesting, you may even get confused, right, with the code. But then that is possible. right? Python doesn't stop you from doing that. So with that, at this point, are there any questions? No question. Okay, all right, so moving on then. We do have about 10 minutes, so let's see. Let me just go quickly over inputs, right? So I said functions. We've been using some functions. I'm just going to have like quick explanation. There's no like definition or anything. Quick explanation on what functions are, what a function is, and we just go over the input function so that we can upgrade our BMI application. Okay, so now for functions, we just said, I think functions, you can actually think about them similar to variables. Like let's say this is technically not the same, right? But then just to give that understanding. So we said that like a variable would have some value, or it's a container for some value that you can reuse, right? For a function, it's more of a block of code, right? So we're writing some code here. There's some block of code that you want to be able to reuse it later, right? So like this whole BMI calculation thing, I want to make it so that I can calculate a BMI anytime without having to write all this again. Okay, so this would be, a function is some block of code that you have stored that you can always call on it to reuse it. Okay, so you want to use it again, all you have to do is just call the name that you've given to that block of code and then use it. Okay, although I've just like simplified it, but it isn't that simple. But then in essence, that is what it is. But there are some extra characteristics that you can add to this. So with the function, it's not as simple as just saying, oh, there's this block of code that I want to use again. And there's a name to it. You would have to also specify if this function is going to take in some inputs, right? Right, so you're going to say, okay, this function, this block of code actually expects that you enter these values before it works, right? Or it doesn't expect anything, right? So there's a lot more complex. But one of the things with function is the fact that you can always reuse some code. Okay, so we're using print here. We use print here. Print here is a function that is built in. So when you have Python generally, when Python is installed, there are some functions that come with it. So these are the built-in functions, right? So automatically comes with Python. The moment you have Python installed, it means that you have those functions available. And print is one of those functions. There are many more. We may not be able to go over all of them, but then yes, that's something that you can also check online. So print is one that allows you to output some information. Then we have input, right? So output some information. You know that in applications, sometimes you'd be asked to enter like a username. Yeah, you're taking some input from a user. A user has to supply some information, and then you, based on that, you either output something or you take some actions. Okay, so it's important to be able to take in inputs from your users, for users to interact with your application. All right, I want to add another code. So that is where the input function comes in here. Okay, great. So input function is simple. What you have is just input. You just input, and you have your brackets, right? And inside, I can just see input here. Okay, let's go simple. So if I said input here, what it tells Python is enter something, right? So there's a cursor is waiting for being the user to interact, right? So Python would wait until I enter something, and that's it. I'm going to get an error for this, but yes, I mean, in this case, I didn't get an error because it's Jupyter Notebook. It was some application I would have gotten an error. So it's waiting for the user to interact. And the moment the user types in enter, it takes in that information and it's available to be used, right? So mainly the input function has some information to take from the user that you need to do something else with it. So there are different ways for you to use this. right? The input that the user enters, you are either going to store it in some variable or you directly use it in something else, right? So you can store it in some variable so that you can always reference it, okay? The other thing, if you did notice, let's just run this again, is I just have this cursor here, right? And for a user, it doesn't, you're not telling me what to enter, right? There's no information, there's nothing, there's just a cursor, and I'm supposed to do whatever I want here. So you definitely do not want it to be that way. You'd want your user to know what you expect them to enter. And the input function allows you to do that. So inside your input function, you can put in a text, and that text is what would give the user a description as to what you expect from them. So we'd say maybe, let's say, enter like your first name, right? Enter your first name. So now your user isn't clueless as to just seeing some cursor and not knowing what to do. So now if we come here again, we see that, okay, enter your first name, right? So it says enter your first name, press enter to confirm. So I know that I'm supposed to enter my first name. Okay, great. So that's what Python allows you to do here. Now that we have this knowledge of inputs, let's upgrade our BMI, right? And see that, okay, what we really want is, instead of this fixed value here, we're actually going to tell the user to enter something. So we say, okay, input weight in kg, okay? And then instead of this fixed value, we go and say input okay, so let me just add enter. Okay, so weight in kg, but like it doesn't have to add extra description. So enter height in cm. Okay, so I'm giving our user this information. We've upgraded our system. It's not some fixed value now. We are taking inputs from users. So let's upgrade. Let's run this. So first thing is waiting for me to enter my weight, right? So I say my weight is 767, right? So, and then it says, okay, enter your height in centimeters. So 170. So wait, what just happened? Right, so great. So can anybody tell me what just happened? Something happened. And I know I did not mention it when we're talking about input here, but like this is extremely important for you to know and understand, especially in Python and any other application. Any idea what happened? You can put it in the chat whilst I wait. Okay, all right. So since I have not seen anything, I would just go ahead and see what the issue is. So I think it's human thinking, right? So you know that I know that I entered 170. I know I entered 67. To me, those are numbers, right? Those are numbers. So Python should know that they are numbers. Those are numbers. Python should know that they are numbers. So why is Python saying I can't do this here? So now Python sees it as any value that actually comes from your input. So anything, when you have inputs, anything that the user enters, Python sees it as a string, even if the user is entering numbers, right? And I think when we talked about the different data types, we said that to Python, 1, 2, 3, here is a string, okay? Human, you see and say, oh, this is a number, right? But Python, so far as it has this code, the data type is a string. So any input from the user, in Python or this input function would always output a value that is a string, okay, even if the user enters it as a number. So for us being the developers and knowing that this is how Python acts, now we'd have to think and make room for that. So like, what then do? We have to convert. So we have to convert this string value that comes in and make sure that it's in a data type that we assume here, right? Because division doesn't work on strings. I think when we talked about operators, There's nothing like division for strings, right? It's numerical values, being integers or floats. So now we'd say that, okay, the string that's coming in here, let's change it to either an integer or a float, right? And so that we can actually work with it. The great thing in Python is there are also built-in functions. We're talking about functions that help you convert from one data type to another. And if I want to convert to integer, for example, what I would do is, let's have it somewhere here. Let's have it somewhere here before we add it to our code. So if I were to say int, right, wrapping it around, right? So the moment I do this, having the type that I want, and I wrap it around it, I'm wrapping it around my value, right? My value would be in the brackets. So the moment that happens, Python sees that, okay, I want to convert the value inside there to an integer type. Okay, right. So if I say int 32, right? 32 as a string. The moment I do this now, Python is actually converting it into an integer value. Okay, so if I were to say float, because I want to convert it to a float. Okay, spelling here. Float 23. Python converted to a float, so I see 32 points there. Okay, all right. So if we were trying to convert something to a string, that one is str, right? So say str, and we add the value that we want to convert. Okay, so we want to convert 32. Okay, so that's how Python would work here. Okay, great. So now that we know that, now let's work on our application and see that, okay, we forgot that we had to convert this. So let's convert everything that the user is entering into an integer, right? So let's wrap it around this whole int function. I'll put it in our function. Okay. Okay. All right, so we wrap this around here, put it in this function, and see that, okay, now we've converted it to integer. So let's run application again, upgraded application, and see what that does. So it's waiting for, yeah, so let's go, what's my name, 67 again. And then, what is my height? 170, so let's enter that. So now it works, right? So now I get my value. It says that my BMI is 23 point something, and then I am within normal weight. Okay, so now we have taken our first BMI application, we've upgraded it based on what we've learned so far. Now we take inputs from users, and now we have some conditions, right? And show some particular text based on some conditional values. Okay, so I think we have come to like 2 minutes over time, so that is it. Any question or anything you would want me to just go over? If not, would be ending. Okay, Mary, thank you. All right, great. So that's mainly it. Hopefully we'll have another session and talk more about function. I think so far we've just talked about, because of time, we just talked about built-in functions, but then we can create our own functions, right? So we'll look at how to create our own functions next. Okay. All right, so thank you. And thank you all for joining. Hopefully you are part of the you're on the Women Who Code page. If you're not, you can either put your email here or the phone number, and we'll add you. Okay, so thank you for joining. Bye. See you next time.
Bye. Thanks too.
Midday, thank you. Bye.